Well, I got invited to, I have to admit to being a little ignorant about the Centésimos Años until I got invited to attend, and then I did some background reading into why the Centésimos was set up and the history of it and so on, and I was really quite intrigued about the platform that was created here. And obviously what I was invited to speak on was food safety, in terms of food loss and waste, so nutritional security. And as a panel, I felt we could have done 2 days on this particular topic alone. So as I said before, I represent the global dairy sector, and in the dairy industry there are 133 million dairy farms in the world. There are 600 million people who live on those dairy farms. And then if you take people like me whose livelihoods depend upon the dairy industry upstream and downstream from the farm, you get another 400 million people whose livelihoods depend upon dairy, my family and families like mine. It's 1 billion people. So if you took the dairy industry and you plonked it in one country, it would be the 3rd largest country in the world. 1 billion people whose livelihoods depend upon dairy. Now for you in Ireland and me in the United States, currently when we think of dairy, we think of large scale, big operations. I think the average in Ireland's now 89 or something cows. In the US, the average is about 300 cows on a dairy farm. Well, the global average is under 2 cows per farm. It's about actually just over 2 cows per farm. And often the farms are primarily something else. They're a mixed farming unit. So if you take India as an example, in India, biggest dairy country in the world. In India, I think there's 70-something million dairy farms in India alone, and they're all like 1 or 2 cows. And typically it's the women in the household that run the dairy business, and the males are running a cropping industry. So they grow lettuce for Mumbai, and then their wives are feeding the cattle on the byproduct from the primary production, which is lettuce. But the difference between dairying and most of these other forms of agriculture is that dairy brings in an income every day, regular income. Most of these cattle, as I mentioned in India as an example, they're not fed on pasture, they're not fed, grains, they're fed byproduct. So waste that would otherwise, become disposed and rotting. They're selling the milk every day. The biggest dairy cooperative in the world is a company called Amul Industries in India. They have 3.6 million cooperative members. Now, if you think about, outside of India, one of the biggest co-ops in the world is Dairy Farmers of America with 14,000 members, and they think managing 14,000 members is a big job. Amul, 3.6 million. So when I moved to New Zealand had like 2.9 million people. So this one cooperative is managing more people than lots of countries. And they pay the farmers that provide them milk at about an average of about $1 per day per cow. It's what they earn in terms of the amount of milk they produce. And that $1 to $2 a day is what allows them to feed their kids, clothe their kids, send their kids to school. It's just an enormous economic powerhouse in the local community. And so countries like India are a fantastic example. In the 1950s, they had a huge program called Operation Flood that was funded by the World Bank, where they were given money to grow their dairy industry. And today it's the biggest dairy industry in the world, India. We've spent a lot of time looking at how do you market in a modern digital age. So if you go back to when I was growing up, or when you were growing up, people of our age group, marketing was all done about segmentation and controlling messages within certain regions. So we would be most used to in our age group with marketing being done through media like magazines, newspapers, television commercials, and you could control the message that went to a particular city or a particular country. You could control it. Whereas in the digital age, you can't control that, and there's quite a change from regionally based messaging to what we call affinity group messaging. So affinity group marketing is a term that you will hear more and more. And in affinity group marketing, that's where people naturally, from all different walks of life, you can't segment them in the way that traditional marketing was done. People from all walks of life over the world will gather together in a social context using social media. Now, as I sat listening to this particular seminar and conference here, what was ringing in the back of my head the whole time was that faith-based models are actually probably the original affinity groups, and that in actual fact for the church, affinity group marketing should allow you to reach a better audience in a more targeted way than traditional marketing, and so communication. So I think there's an upside to the modern digital age, particularly when I think about it from the church's perspective. There are enormous difficulties with managing messaging and so on, but you have to kind of change the way you think about it, and you have to go with the flow. And it's not about telling people, it's about allowing them to find out themselves. So you provide signposts and directions, you don't provide direct tell statements. So it's an interesting conference. You can take that view, or you can take the view that these are platforms. And so Facebook, Google, Twitter, Snapchat, they are just a platform. And you choose what information you wish to place on that platform. Now, I think we're starting to see with some of the legal cases that are coming in, we're starting to see those platforms being challenged more to be editorial in how they manage content. But I don't think any of the church's teachings are in conflict with what they're trying to do. I think there's an opportunity to provide a modern message using those technologies and platforms. Think of them as a platform rather than as a challenge.